themselves on mute. With that, we are so honored to welcome Dr. Imogen R to give the 18th annual CCHCSP keynote address. Dr. Ko was the founding dean of the Faculty of Science of Ryerson University from 2012 to 2018. She's currently a professor of chemistry and biology at Ryerson University and an affiliate scientist at St. Michael's Hospital, Toronto, where her research group studies drug transport proteins. She is the incoming president of the Canadian Molecular Biosciences Society and sits on various boards. In addition to her work as a research scientist, Dr. Ko is an internationally recognized as a Canadian thought leader in the integration of principles of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, IDEA for short, particularly into science and medicine. She has advised academia, government, and industry on best practices and approaches toward inclusive excellence and has contributed to national dialogue about these issues through various platforms. She is much in demand as a speaker and panelist and has received numerous awards for her advocacy work. When Dr. Ko agreed to give this talk, we did not know that she would be speaking in a forever changed world due to COVID-19, during Pride Month and in the midst of the events we're witnessing. Perhaps it was destiny that she will talk about inclusive excellence, improving cancer research, and creating cultures of care. Thank you, Dr. Ko, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Susan and Linda. Thank you for the whole organization. It's a tremendous honor to be able to speak to such a group of future influencers and change makers, and I hope that we can promote dialogue on these important issues, particularly at this time, but going forward and as a continued conversation. Now, let me see if I can find my slides. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, I can.
And I'm also going to put on the closed captioning there so that this is an accessible presentation. So thank you for that very generous introduction. Here you can see a little bit about me. You can also find me on social media, which has been a very influential platform for increasing accessibility, particularly for voices of those who often feel that they don't have a voice or they're not heard. So I've written about the power of social media as an influencer for social change. I always start my presentations with where I do my work. Even though I'm not on campus right now, I'm still in Southern Ontario, and Southern Ontario is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. That is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that brought them together to protect the resources, protect the territory, protect the land. Other people have come into this treaty. This is the official land acknowledgement for Ryerson, but these are living documents that we must continually reflect on. So I no longer use this language about being invited into this treaty. Land was stolen, land was taken. The history of these land treaties is something we must be really aware of, and we must integrate into our thinking. However, the guiding principles can frame our work, and those principles of the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. This is our Aboriginal special advisor to the president, the Aboriginal elder, Joanne Dallaire, holding up the wampum belt, which is the representation of the treaty. It is the treaty itself. An example of different ways of figuring out, different ways of thinking about governance structures. Oops. I also want us to acknowledge and be really honest about the fact that science and medicine have a very long history of sexism, racism, and colonialism, and we cannot create cultures of care without acknowledging and incorporating these facts into our understanding of ourselves, our research, our work, and our communities. So these are difficult, uncomfortable conversations, and we must have them. We must be brave. So I have had a conventional career as a research scientist. I've published research papers. I've done the conventional things as a researcher, trying to understand the nature of regulation, structure, and function of a class of transporter proteins. And I've been very fortunate and hugely privileged to be able to pursue a passion that I've had for as long as I can remember. But from as long as I can remember, I also recognize that there were people that didn't get to do what I wanted to do, didn't get to pursue their passions because of very arbitrary decisions that other people made about them, decisions on the basis of their gender, of their ethnicity, of their socioeconomic background. And so this led me to an acquired expertise on issues around equity, diversity, and inclusion, particularly in science and medicine, or STEM, as we colloquially call it, science, technology, engineering, and math. In the UK and other parts of the world, they'll add medicine on the end, so it's STEM. And so as a lived experience and a deep academic understanding, I've also contributed to these discussions in these areas in Canada and in other places. And I've written about these issues in academic scholarship type settings, as well as for a broader population. So that is sort of, I've managed to intertwine these two aspects of how I see the world and what I want to do, my love of science and my strong belief in a fairer, more equitable kind of science and a more just world. And it is possible to have these two aspects to what you do in your everyday life or in your professional life. And I would argue, and I do argue, that these expertise, these kinds of skills around equity, around social justice, are actually core competencies that we should all have as scientists and clinicians. I've been asked a lot about gender issues. As a woman in science, I get asked repeatedly, particularly to speak to issues around women in science or gender in science. I always try to promote the fact that we need to be viewing things more broadly than that. It's not a women in science issue, it's a human rights issue, it's an everybody in science issue. But this is an example of some resources that I highly, highly recommend from a special issue of The Lancet last year. It's not paywalled, but it talks about advancing women in science and global health. And it has many voices, including voices from the global south, which I think is really important, that we have a diversity of voices. And very often in Canada, especially, when we talk about women in science, we're talking about white women in science, and we have to do better. I also want to remind everybody that women are not a diversity group. And when we're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, we're not talking about women as a diversity group. They're 50% of the population, actually 51% of the population. But there are women who are extremely underrepresented, racialized women, marginalized women, queer women, disabled women, and we have to have an intersectional lens when we're talking about equity issues or we're talking about gender. Gender is also not binary, so we have a range of genders. And really importantly, and I always include this in all my talks, but it's particularly relevant right now, is that we cannot address sexism in science, technology, engineering, math, and medicine without addressing racism. And that's really important. And sometimes I feel a level of discomfort, particularly amongst white women in science, that if you want to work on solving issues around sexism, then you have to step up and call out racism. You have to, we all have to. Injustice is inclusive. It is includes a lot of, there are so many communities and people who experience injustice. Black people experience injustice, and we must step up and act. Privilege is more than your gender. It is also your color. It might be your sexuality. It's often your socioeconomic class. It's the privilege that you were born into because you had affluent parents. So one thing we can all be is intersectional in our thinking and in our work. I was going to show this little video, but I think I won't in the interest of time. But it's something that was put out by the company Always, and it's about microaggressions and gender stereotypes. And I think particularly for those individuals working with young women of color, young women with disabilities, girls, it's really important to look at the impact of gender stereotypes on young people, and how gender stereotyping and microaggressions are internalized and how they impact things like healthy activities. So I will share these slides, and you can go and check out some of these other resources. This Always Like a Girl really talks to young girls and young women about, when did like a girl become an insult? Can you run like a girl? Oh, you throw like a girl. You fight like a girl. When did that become an insult? And what are we going to do about it? Words matter. And remember that gender stereotyping disenfranchises boys as much as it disenfranchises girls. Gender equity means healthier boys and men. That's well established. There's tons of scholarship on that. And this is another little video that speaks to that. But it's not just gender. We know that racism impacts health. We know that racism impacts outcomes, and it's really important to be absolutely intentionally aware of the bias that is built in, the systemic racism that exists around us in medicine, in science. So here is an example. We can measure racism, we can study it, we can use it as a topic for scholarship so we can really understand it. There's no excuse for anybody to say, I didn't think that science was racist or medicine was racist. So here's an example of an algorithm that's used to help decision making. And a lot of people think that artificial intelligence is sort of neutral. It's not. We can bake in the bias that exists in society into, for instance, decision making algorithms. And we have bad outcomes, and we can measure them. We can see how structural racism can kill. Here's an example of, it's a case study of how an African-American woman was treated differently because of her ethnicity. And we can see how racism has toxic effects. And we know that people think of racism as interpersonal. Somebody is racist, you're racist, I'm racist. It can be unconscious. I didn't know I was being racist. But what we're actually talking about how it's structural. It's built in to the systems that we work in, the systems that we often support, that we often abide by. It's designed into the way we do our daily work and our daily business. And that's really what we have to be challenging on a regular basis. And given the area of expertise and your profession, many of you, I'm sure, will have seen these reports, the statement that came out from the American Academy of Pediatrics on the impact of racism on child and adolescent health. And although these are American studies and American surveys and American experiences, they're very analogous to what goes on in Canada. We cannot, despite what you may have heard from, leaders, politicians, Canada is racist. We do have systemic racism. We have systemic racism against people of color, against Black people. We have systemic racism against Indigenous people, and we have to be honest about this, and we have to face up to these uncomfortable truths, and we have to get comfortable with discomfort. This is a very un-Canadian thing. This is a real Canadian challenge. When I talk to my international comparators, my collaborators who do similar work in other countries, I ask them, do you think there's a Canadian problem with getting used to discomfort? And they say, yeah, that's a big challenge for Canada because we're very polite, we're sort of passive aggressive in terms of wanting to avoid making people feel uncomfortable. But the reality is we're gonna have to go to some uncomfortable and some painful places. We're going to have to ensure that we build in anti-racism training. And this is an example of a racist experience that a doctor had in Vancouver. Again, what I would consider a microaggression, but just an example of systemic societal attitudes, even within a healthcare setting, that can impact somebody's, perhaps the potential of somebody getting a good treatment. So it's really important as researchers, as young researchers, as early career researchers, that everybody understand the importance of sex and gender plus based experimental design. So that's now built in, it's mandatory in the Tri-Councils. And sex and gender plus, so that means more than gender, that means things like ethnicity and sexuality and socioeconomic background. And what understanding the importance of that in experimental design means that you will be doing the best science or the best medical research that you can do. In combination with that, researchers should have core competencies in the integration of equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility into their research teams, their research programs. Can you teach inclusively? How do you manage a group? How do you promote a program? And that means becoming the best scientist or researcher, clinician, mentor, teacher, professional colleague you can be. So one is about doing the best science you can do, and one is about being the best scientist or researcher or medical health professional that you can be. And I do come across quite a lot of sort of fuzziness about the distinction between sex and gender-based analysis plus and EDI. I've seen this in CIHR grants, I've seen this in NSERC grants to some extent. So it's important to understand the distinction between those two sort of major concepts. And if we actually were hiring for core competencies around these issues, if we actually hired men and women of all ethnicities, of all colors, who had a really deep understanding of sexism and racism, then we would end up having less of these kinds of issues of sexual harassment, of racism that go on, and that are going on at every institution in Canada. So I'm picking on University of Manitoba, and pick on other institutions. It's everywhere. It's in our systems, and we have to see it, and we have to challenge it, and we have to fix it. So to create cultures of care, you need to be practitioners of care. And we need to understand our history so that we can actually identify those racist structures that we have, and we can replace them, and we can create better cultures of care. So some of you may be familiar with Queen's University, which has this history of being initially quite progressive and taking in a number of young Black men into medical school 100 years ago. But then post First World War, there was a sort of a racist backlash, and those young Black men in medical school were heavily pressured to leave. They weren't immediately forced out, but they were strongly encouraged to leave, and they did leave. And so there was this racist ban on Black students studying medicine for many, many years. It wasn't actually, it was kind of forgotten, but it wasn't officially repealed until really very recently. And it's Edward Thomas, who is a science, has a background in science, chemical engineering, I think, who at Queen's, who really uncovered this and worked very hard to correct this, and then incorporate mandatory classes at Queen's in the medical school so that those mistakes would not be repeated, so that people knew that, yes, there is a racist history in our medical and science cultures and systems in Canada. Failure to incorporate principles of EDI, or sex and gender-based analysis, into science and medicine leads to bad science, and to bad medicine, and to bad public policy, and to bad governance, and to bad urban planning. There's no doubt about that. That's well established. We can study it, we can measure it. We know that our genomics, our databases are often skewed. They're skewed towards Eurocentric, white populations, and that's a problem when you're trying to develop policy around precision medication or precision medicine, and you're trying to develop drugs. If your GWAS is so skewed because your databases are skewed, then you're not going to get the best outcomes. You're not going to get the best science, the best medicine. Lots of resources that you can look into, and remember that this disenfranchises everybody. Osteoporosis is underdiagnosed and undertreated in men. So inclusive design, increased attention to diversity, increases accuracy, increases care, increases the quality of the science, quality of the medicine for everybody. Excellent books here, Caroline Criada Perez and Angela Saini. Right now, Superior is available. This book, Superior by Angela Saini, is available for free as an ebook. I strongly recommend both Superior and Inferior. Angela Saini has a background as a physicist, but she's now a very talented and skilled writer on the history of sexism in science and how science has been used to support racism. And so we have done our own work here in Canada. Kara Tannenbaum, who is director of one of the Institutes for Health at CIHR, published this last year in, I think it's Science, Sex and Gender Analysis Improves Science and Engineering. So it's what we want. We want excellence, right? We want inclusive excellence, and we want the best. I often get this sort of subtle pushback around EDI issues means, oh, we're going to lower the bar. We're going to somehow, you know, we're going to, this myth of meritocracy. Actually, no, what I'm doing is I'm saying we expect better. When I'm reviewing a CIHR grant, if your experimental design doesn't include sex and gender-based analysis as appropriate, usually, you know, what are the sex of the cells you're using? Do you have the right combination of mice or whatever it is? If you can't figure that out to make the very best experimental design, then that speaks to your ability to do the very best science. So we're looking for the best. We're actually raising the bar. We're not lowering the bar. So in creating cultures of care, we want to be recruiting people with core competencies, and we want to be identifying and removing institutionalized structural racism and sexism. This is a great paper that came out last year. It's the Journal of Infectious Disease, but it applies to all communities of care. It could be cancer research, it could be pediatrics, it could be all sorts of care. And it talks about building cultures of care, building cultures and climates of care, starting locally, but we have these kind of concentric rings, and we have these things that feed in to a culture of care. And we're talking about cultural shift. If we've got racism and sexism going on in our medical schools or our universities or our healthcare system, then we need to shift that culture. And I'm sure many of you have been involved in sort of strategic planning initiatives where there have been groups, there have been town halls, or there have been workshops on things like innovation, performance, growth, you know, new strategies to do this, that, and the other. But remember that culture eats strategy for everything. So culture will always eat strategy. And what that means is your institutional culture is what the very worst is that you allow. So you can have all the town halls on strategic planning and, you know, your new strategic plan or your new research plan. But if your culture is one that says, you know, we're going to let racist jokes go in the lab, we're going to hire people that look like us, then that is really what's going on. And all of the strategy you have is useless. You're striving for excellence. Your strategy is useless if your culture is one that allows those behaviors to take place. And we want culture shift towards inclusive excellence. One of the challenges for science and medicine and the healthcare system is the structure of that particular organization. And so much of the work around organizational cultural shift has come from the corporate world, from business schools, where there's a very traditional hierarchy of a CEO, upper management, middle management. The challenge for many of us is we work in organizations that are much more like holocracies. The power is distributed, there could be subcircles, super circles, and so who has control, who has power, who has the ability to shift culture can be a lot less clear, there can be a lot less transparency, which means there's a lot more tendency or risk for power to be abused or culture to be one that's unhealthy. So we need to know what our organizations look like. And then of course we have to be realistic. Our cultures of care are made up of people. So here are some little Keith Haring people, great San Francisco artist, celebration of Pride Month, little people. All of our cultures of care are made up of people. Our culture is made up of people. So it's really, we're talking about cultural shift in people. And we need to be doing that at our local levels, at our community levels, at our national levels, at our organizational levels, and all of these levels. And so when you're talking about multiple levels of change, you're really talking about looking at a systems approach of how are you going to affect that change. So where you sit in the system is also going to influence what you can do. So a systems approach really is, we're going to have to look at cultural shifts or reflective shifts in everything from personal level up to teams. How do you run your research group? Do you have a lab code of conduct? Do you have expectations around behavior that is inclusive? Divisional, departmental society? Do you have a departmental website where you have EDI resources? Does your department run events to help educate faculty? And institutional cultures, which bring all of these other groups together, can be quite challenging because different elements of an institution or organization may be at different levels or different places in their journey towards inclusive excellence. Whatever level you're at and whoever you are, and whether you're an individual or a massive organization, culture shift starts with reflection. And after the events of last week and much of the ongoing conversations, I really think that this is a time for us to be reflective of ourselves and our organizations. And the things that we need to be thinking about are, what are your core values? If you're in a profession of care, your core values are probably defined for you by your professional body, but also what are your personal core values? I couldn't do anything other than what I do. I can't be any other way than I am, because I see the world as unfair, and I am just motivated and driven to challenge that. And that may cost me some things. People might not like what I have to say, but I have to be true to my core values. Where did they come from? For me, they came from the way I was raised, from parents who had very humble socioeconomic backgrounds. None of my grandparents finished high school, but my parents got to go to university because they shifted the university structure in the UK from it being for rich white people to being for everybody, including from kids from poor backgrounds. How do you enact your culture or your values? What are your biases? We're all biased. You can test your bias from the Harvard implicit bias test. We all have biases. We're human. There's good neuroscience, good evolutionary biology as to why we have biases. They are hardwired into us. But we are also animals with big brains. We can recognize them and interrupt them. So I'm not saying to people, don't be biased. I'm saying, reflect on yourself and understand what your biases are and where they come from, and then learn to recognize them, catch them as they appear in your frontal cortex, and then interrupt them, disrupt them. Learn how to be a better ally, recognizing, as Roxane Gay said, that we need to move beyond allyship. We shouldn't need allies. So we hear a lot about allies right now, but Black people don't want allies. They want a system that treats them fairly and equally. So we have to get there, and that means by being better allies, but we also want to put ourselves out of business as allies. What are the behaviors you must change? Maybe you're somebody who uses jokes or a little bit of sarcasm to, sort of get through the day. That's the way you are. Maybe you need to change that. Maybe you need to interrupt that, unlearn that. What are the assumptions you have? How can you develop core competencies? I don't care what color, race, background, sexuality you are. You need to have a core competency. Hiring now is looking for this. We look for these core competencies in everybody we hire. I would rather have a really skilled young man have these core competencies than this idea that somehow we're only hiring people from minority groups. Not true. What are the qualities that really help us develop these skills in terms of EDI awareness? Well, humility. I am a woman with enormous white privilege, huge white privilege. I also have an accent that gives me huge privilege. I recognize that privilege, and I must use that privilege. I must have humility to use that privilege in a way that elevates others, because I've had so many advantages. I recognize the gender disadvantages, but also so much privilege. I have humility towards, my position, and I must use that. I have responsibility. Empathy. I think every student should be graduating with empathy. Honesty, that means honesty with yourself, heightened self-awareness. Things that we have to talk about that are going to be painful. Privilege. Toxic masculinity, let's talk about that, because toxic masculinity kills men. White women tears, there's a lot about women in science and women in medicine, and it's often white women. And so, as we saw with Amy Cooper last week, white women can sort of, they can use the white women tears in ways that are very aggressive and very racist. We need to talk about bullying and toxic workplaces. We have some world experts in Canada around bullying and toxic workplaces in medicine, people like Sharon Strauss at St. Mike's. We need to talk about gendered expectations and gendered norm. We need to talk about implicit and explicit bias. And we need to talk about the structures and the processes and the policies, the actionable things that need to be done to affect change. Many of you may have seen this pyramid of racism and the different ways that racism is entrenched, and how how much of it is socially acceptable, how much of it is covert. The things that I have heard, you know, even in the last year or so, in terms of my work, have been things like color blindness. I don't see color. Well, that means you don't see people. But we're all just one human family. Racist jokes and not challenging them. I hear this a lot from graduate students, racist and sexist jokes, how to challenge them. Can you give us some tips and tools and strategies on what to do there? And the white savior complex. Here am I as a white woman coming in and telling you all how to do it. Well, actually, no, you know, that's not what I should be doing. That's not what we should be doing. We should be ensuring that if there's a panel that I'm asked to be on, I ask to see the panel, and if there are no women of color, and I've done this, take myself off that panel and say, no, here's a bunch of names of other people that you need to be reaching out to. EDI work, idea work is hard. It's hard. You have to do the work, and I find that people don't want to do the work. They just want a handout. They want to check the box, but it's hard work, and it should be expected. It should be a core competency. It should be recognized and rewarded. It should be part of recruitment, tenure and promotion, part of awards, funding. We're seeing it now more integrated into tri-councils, and that's good because money incentivizes behavior. And sometimes that's the only way you can get behavior to change, is by saying, if you don't do something, you won't get money. If there is real change going on, people will push back. There will be pushback. Not everybody is on board with this. It's not all dolphins and rainbows and unicorns. It's people will push back and get hostile. That means that's how you know it's working. So you have to expect that. You have to expect for people to not like these conversations, and you have to plan for them, be strategic. And remember that when you're challenging systems of power and privilege, those people that have benefited from those systems of power and privilege are going to feel like they're losing something. So when you're accustomed to privilege, equity, equality, which are different, know the difference, equity and equality can feel like oppression. So we have to get comfortable with discomfort, and actually uncomfortable teams can perform better. And this is Sarah Kaplan's and others' work at UT. A lot of stuff on this slide, but these are some actionable items, things that you can actually do in terms of incorporating these ideas. You can do allyship training, learn to supervise cross-culturally if you're a PI. For heaven's sakes, learn how to do EDI and SGBA in your research grants. If you don't know how to do that, there's lots of excellent resources, but I've seen grants, you know, there is now discussion going on, and if you don't have that in your grant, you're not going to do as well as somebody who does have it in their grant. What does your division look like? Is your department welcome? You can see on my background, on my camera, you know, my Zoom background, I've got the Pride Month flag up. Does your department do that? Does anybody say, hey, you know, happy LGBTQ and STEM Day, which is in November? What does your division do? And if they're not doing something they need to do, suggest that they need to do it, particularly things like allyships, bystander training for graduate students. That's a great place to start. And remember that behaviors define culture. So it really is, we're looking for behaviors to shift. What you say, what you do, how you act. So set expectations if you have the ability. It might just be you and your lab group. It might be you and your colleagues in your team. If somebody doesn't do something, there needs to be accountability and there need to be consequences. We're looking for behaviors to change because behaviors define culture. And I just want to finish with this because it is Pride Month. And I just want to remind people that we have Pride Month in June because it is when the Stonewall riots happened in June. And so the Stonewall riots were sort of a pivotal moment in the awareness and sort of raising of the issues around the gay community. And that's something that maybe we can think about as we're looking at what's happening in anti-racism responses right now. So this was a message that I got from a colleague, a young researcher at U of T in pharma, and he is a young gay man. I was on a panel with him. He spoke about his journey as a young gay man in a country where it was very different. He's an immigrant to Canada. It was very difficult for him to be openly gay in his country of origin. The toll on his mental health was significant. He talked about that on this panel, talked about his journey, came to Canada. He's now in a very supportive, fabulous lab, but still was not comfortable about being out. And he talked about how that drained him. By Wednesday, he was exhausted. He couldn't do his best work. He couldn't contribute to some of the really important research that was going on. He had to continually edit himself in his mind every Monday morning when people were talking about what they did on the weekend. He would edit himself. So by Wednesday, he was exhausted. And finally, he got to a place where he felt he could come out and was finally himself, his full authentic self. And he started to tell his story. And it's incredibly important and incredibly powerful. And I've encouraged him to tell more people because people need to hear this. I recommended him for this LGBTQ in STEM conference at the University of Windsor in the fall of 2019. And he was on a panel with other scientists and mathematicians and biomedical scientists talking about being gay in science. And he came back and he said to me, I've never felt more at home in a room full of strangers, to be honest. It was truly a great experience. And I was very happy for him, but it was also so sad that somebody in science, in biomedical sciences, in medicine, would feel that because of who they were more comfortable in a room of strangers. This is not a culture of care. We need to be creating cultures of care where everybody can be their true, full, authentic selves. And we have inclusive excellence and a place where it's safe to be who you are. So thanks very much. Be brave, not perfect. You're going to get it wrong, but together we can be better and we can do better. And I'm hopeful. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Coe. That was incredible. And I just need to take a minute to reflect on many of the things that you said. To compose myself. I think we needed to hear this message today, and I thank you. I wonder if we can open up the floor to some questions. I'm going to try and look at my other computer to see if I can see the chat box. And Linda, maybe you can help me by manning the chat box.
Sure, Susan. So we have our first question and comment. It's from Merle Brockway. Says, I struggle the most with white savior complex. When I first learned about intersectionality and white feminism, I became fearful of speaking out because I didn't want to be a white savior. I have lots of female white privilege. I want to enact meaningful change. However, I sometimes overthink my actions so much it prevents me from acting. Do you have any advice on how to move beyond this so I can be more effective in my practice?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I think you're already on that journey because you're aware of it. You're aware of this thing, which is this kind of white savior complex that we see a lot of. I think, and I totally empathize with that, totally recognize that, and I know that I've been guilty of that. So I think one thing is to recognize it and state it out loud and be really clear that that's not what you're aiming for, but you are trying to use your privilege to raise the platform for others. How are you going to do that? How can you do that in whatever the work is that you do? So really think about what is it that you can do to use your privilege, but then step back and actually raise others. And that could be panels, it could be invitations, it could be a whole variety of things. I think also we have to be really honest that we're going to get it wrong. You're going to make mistakes, you're going to screw up, you're going to get called out on it. And sometimes that's really painful, and sometimes that's really difficult. And you have to really be ready to take that painful learning experience away and dwell on it, think about it, but acknowledge that it's better to do something and get it wrong than not to do anything. So I totally understand that kind of you get paralyzed because you're going to get it wrong. But doing something is better, acknowledging that you're going to get it wrong sometimes, and then really, if you have a strong core sense of your own values and why you're doing what you're doing, you can get through those difficult things. If you're doing it because you want to make yourself look good, think about how do I feel? Am I doing this because I want myself to feel good? I want the praise. Is it because I want the praise for doing this? Then can be a bit of a signal to say, that's a bit of a white savior complex. So a lot of self-awareness, a lot of reflection, and courage. Be brave, not perfect.
Thanks so much. Is there any other questions? And Marlee says, thank you. Marlee is saying thank you as well. And Shannon McDonald is letting us know that she has the exact same issue, and she's thanking Marlee for reaching out about this.
While others, I think Nancy Young has a question. Sometimes we need to use our privilege to highlight the perspectives of others. Thanks for raising this.
Yep.
Just endorse.
Yeah, that's something that I have found I've tried to do, is that people will, almost every time after I have given a talk, usually in person, somebody will come up and they'll tell me their story. And it's something that they haven't been able to tell a supervisor, a department chair, a colleague, or whatever. And sometimes they're quite traumatic. And I've taken those stories, I collect them, I write them down. And then I have asked their permission and say, can I tell your story? But of course, I'll remove the names of everything. So you can use your privilege to elevate the voices of others, and make sure that their voices are heard and there's space for their voices, and other people have to listen to them.
I have a question for Dr. Ko. We have a number of trainees on the call. They're at the beginning of their journey in their academic career, and they'll be going on to be change makers and influencers, holding many leadership positions in science and medicine and policy in Canada and healthcare. I have two questions for you. One is, how did you come to these realizations? Where were the intersection points earlier in your career? You talked a little bit about your family, but during your early training, and how did you change over time to become who you are today with this awareness? And the other half of that question is, what advice would you have for us as a training program? And we're in the midst of redesigning our training program. What would be some of the things, what would be one or two of the core advice or key values or things that you would think that we should do as critical for our program?
That's a lot of questions. So I think I've always been this way. So I don't think, and I think I've been learning all along, and my awareness has been deepening and strengthening in terms of the scholarship and the depth of understanding. So I think I started out very much recognizing that women were underrepresented, and not just in science. And I can remember that as early as being 7 years old, and my little co-ed class being split into girls doing sewing lessons and boys doing woodworking lessons, and that not making any sense to me. Like, it wasn't a gender thing. It just, like, why would you pick tall people and short people, or why would you pick people with blue eyes and green eyes? So there's kind of cognitive dissonance between what was supposed to be being measured, like, can you do something, and who was getting picked. And I can remember watching sports with my dad and saying, why aren't girls doing pole vaulting? Because that looked kind of exotic and slightly dangerous. And I thought, maybe I'd like to do that. This was a long time ago. Of course, they do now. And so I was aware that the world kind of was weird that way. So I think I've always had that. I think that understanding kind of expanded into, well, actually, it's the rich kids that get to do some things, and they get to go on field trips. Like, I can't afford to do that in undergraduate, but if you can come up with a chunk of money, volunteering in the lab is a classic example as a proxy for privilege, which we're very aware of at Ryerson. So I think I've always been aware that the world is not fair, and that this myth of meritocracy is truly a myth. So, and I've really tried to figure out why that is. I mean, I'm a scientist, so I'm just curious. Like, why is that? Like, why is it that way? That makes no sense. And so I always try to figure out, why is that? And so hanging on to that curiosity and hanging on to that questioning, I think, is really, if somebody says you must do this and you say, why must I do that? And they say, well, that's the way it's always been. That's a real, red flag, I think. And we see a lot of that in hiring faculty, in, the way we run programs. Well, it's always been that way. Well, that's not a good reason for anything. I want better, so better. So I think...
Your advice for our program.
Yeah. So I think, so we've, in Canada in particular, we spent a lot of time focusing on fixing the people who are underrepresented, like fixing women, fixing people of color, fixing Black people. We have programs for Indigenous students. We have programs for, marginalized students. We have programs for people who need fixing. And if you actually added up the proportion of the population that makes, it's about 70% of the population, at least in the US it is. So why do we have programs to fix 70% of the population? Like, maybe we should have programs for 30% of the population, which is what white straight men are in the US, for them to learn more. So the point of that is, not a gender thing, the point of that is that programming needs to be inclusive. That's not to say that we don't need programs for particular groups. We do need programs that give, that help young people from certain backgrounds develop skills, tools, strategies. And that might be confidence building in young women. It might be learning to navigate complex social structure, academic structures for students from backgrounds who never had a parent who went to university. But we also need to have programming for those people who represent the majority in the system, which doesn't look like the majority in the population, right? So I'm a big proponent of programming that really focuses on core competencies for young white straight men, because these are skill sets. These are employability skill sets. Bystander training, allyship training, incredibly powerful. Gender equity and why it's good for men, boys and men, incredibly powerful. And they're doing this at places like the University of Waterloo with the engineering students. So inclusive training, and then specifics for groups as needed.
There's a question from the chat box from Chelsea Derber. Thank you for this great talk. Can you speak to the unique experiences of people who are biracial, half white, half minority?
Yes, so I can't speak to those experiences because I don't have those experiences, and it would be presumptive of me to do that. But I think that one thing that we should all be doing, particularly those people like me who have white privilege, is to be making sure that we hear the lived experiences of those people. So we don't need to do nearly enough of that. And, I gave this advice one time when I was speaking to graduate students. It's like, if you're in a research group where you have, a whole diversity of people there, have you ever asked any of those people, what are your traditions around the Christmas break, right? So what are your traditions for when a new baby comes into the family? Have you, so learning from and hearing those people. That's not to say that those people, it's those people's jobs to educate you, right? So it's your job to educate yourself, but making sure that there is space and time to hear the voices and lived experiences of those people. I think it's one of the things classic things I say all the time is that you have a voice, you have a right to use that voice, and you have a reasonable expectation that other people will shut up and let you speak, right? So I think we need to be really intentional about providing space and time to hear those voices and hear those lived experiences of those people. And you have to, again, it has to be frontal cortex. It has to be really intentional.
Claudia Tersigny says, amazing talk, so needed at this time. From Michelle Hebert, thank you for this thoughtful, honest, critical presentation. I appreciate the resources and examples you provided to further our understanding regarding inequalities and racism and concrete actions to take. Are there any other questions from the group now that you've had a chance to reflect and take in what Dr. Ko has said and others have been asking? Please feel free to unmute your mic and speak up. We have 5 more minutes to take your questions.
Can I venture a comment?
Go ahead.
Jean-Sébastien speaking from Montreal. And I'm a white, heterosexual, extremely privileged male. And honestly, I hear this talk and I'm humbled, and I obviously have not considered half of the intricacies of the complex nature of the discussion, but I often feel that I'm ill-equipped to even consider a path to action that seems fraught and mined with all kinds of dangers for a man like me. And I almost often feel that the safest course of action is to be reflective and let others that have been muted for so long take all the space, you know, and avoid putting my foot in my mouth and making a fool of myself as a white privileged male, you know. So I don't know if you have any advice for the guys like us who realize that you're right, you know, that we were privileged all along. And I hope I didn't contribute directly to this injustice, but I'm sure I have in some ways through my upbringing and culture. So now I'm trying to take a reflective step backwards, but inaction has never felt so comfortable for me either. I always feel like I have to do something if something is unfair, but maybe it's not my time to right this wrong, or I have to enable that change, but I don't think I should be at the forefront, or I don't know how to be at the forefront of this. You know, it seems very dangerous, actually, or not my place, actually.
Yeah. It is dangerous. You wouldn't believe some of the comments that I get, and the opportunities that I have probably lost because I'm too activist. So
well, at least you're a woman. At least you're a woman. You know, you fill one of the cases. You're one of the minority, you know, or a wronged group in this. I'm a man on top of it, you know. So that's
well, yeah, but I challenge gender stereotypes on a number of levels.
Yeah.
But I would say I also have huge privilege. So if you have privilege like you do, you have responsibility. So I totally understand the fear of getting it wrong, and you're not alone. You're not alone at all. I mean, that is a very, very common feeling. It's a very appropriate feeling. It's a very normal feeling. It's a very human feeling. So that's fine. You shouldn't feel bad about feeling that way. But to be paralyzed by that fear is problematic. So the question is, you know, and you're already on the journey, I would say. The question is, how are you going to act on the responsibility that comes along with your privilege? So, and that means being reflective. It means educating yourself by, you know, you showed up here, you listened. You don't get any cookies for that. You don't get any special award for that, because that's the minimum that everybody should be doing. I'm always kind of irritated when I give talks on inclusive excellence and, you know, there aren't men in the room. That used to be the case. I talked to women in the room like 10 years ago, but now actually I would say most of my rooms are gender diverse. So that's good. And then the question is, what can you do? Well, there's a ton of things you can do. You have privilege, which means you have power. So you have the ability to make change in ways that other people can't. How do you go about doing that? Well, you're going to have to educate yourself. You're going to have to figure out where you fit in your organization. You're going to have to look for opportunities and be really intentional. You're going to have to, there's nothing more powerful than white men calling out other white men. So if one of your buddies in a room makes a sexist comment or makes an inappropriate comment, and there aren't any women in the room, you know, or in a group or at a conference or whatever, then it's your job to speak up and call that out. That's what you can do. I can't do that because I get called names, or I get other kinds of hostile pushback. But you have things that you can do that actually other people can't do, and you're safe to do them. So it's just a question of learning how to do those things, where you can do them, and then using your privilege and your power for good. You can do it. Be brave, have courage, learn the skills.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I had the privilege of attending the Pediatric Scientist Development Training Program in the United States, and they actually provided seminars on how to become an ally, on allyship, and how to do exactly the latter things that Dr. Ko mentioned. So we look forward to providing some of those types of seminars for you in the future. And the most important thing is to be brave and to have courage. And I just wanted to reassure you, Jean-Sébastien, that you will not make a mistake. You will only make a change, a movement towards positive change. So be brave. Any other questions?
Can I ask just one last question? I get a lot of feedback when I enter this space about how angry I am. And I think I do feel angry. I think I feel an appropriate amount of anger, but I'm also a woman, and so that anger is really threatening. I literally, during this talk, got an email from my department head about how angry I am about our university's response to what's going on in the US. I felt like it was inadequate, and I don't know who to talk to about that. And so I'm in this difficult space of like, I'm a woman and I know I'm not supposed to be angry because I'm a woman, but I have these feelings. And I actually find them really motivating, you know, when I can be true with them. And so how do you respond to feedback like that?
Well, first of all, it's really gendered. It's a way to undermine you. Okay, so the angry woman trope is a classic gendered stereotype that is a way to minimize and belittle. So you're going to get it, it's going to happen, but you have to figure out how to like take it and put it aside. I have colleagues who are Black women who will not speak up will barely speak up in meetings because they really don't want to fall into the angry Black woman trope, which is even worse. So I think being angry is really appropriate. And people are going to call you angry, and you're going to have to get used to it to some extent. But you can also figure out ways to sort of channel that and use it to drive. People have asked me why I'm not raging angry. I am raging furious, and I have been for a very long time. And it drives me. It drives me, and so it drives me to figure out how to fix it and how to do better and how to make a contribution. So. Yeah, absolutely. We should be angry. And if people say you're angry, of course I'm angry. Of course I'm angry. There's things wrong here that we need to do better, and you need to do better. And I'm going to carry on being angry. I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable. You could also say that. I'm sorry if that makes you feel uncomfortable. But yes, I'm absolutely justified in my anger.
Thank you.
Own it.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Ko. We are so honored to have heard this lecture from you at this time. I'm inspired by who you are and what you stand for and how you expressed yourself. And Canada needs leaders like you, and we're just so privileged to have listened to you over the last hour. So if we cannot do a global clap, but maybe people can send in their appreciation through the Zoom clap function to thank Dr. Ko.
This is applause in the deaf community. So this is applause. Thank you.